The Battle of Issus. It occurred in 333 BC between Alexander the Great and the Persian king Darius during Alexander's campaign to subjugate the Persian Empire. Despite significant numerical disadvantage, Alexander leveraged the constricted terrain to counteract the Persians' superiority in numbers. His resolute cavalry assault penetrated the Persian formations, prompting Darius to abandon the battlefield. It was a triumph that cemented Alexander's status as a military prodigy and granted him dominion over Asia Minor. Subsequently, Darius attempted to negotiate peace. However, Alexander declined, persisting in his conquest. The following is a reading from the Anabasis of Alexander by Arrian of Nicomedia, an ancient source, sometime after the days of Alexander, but generally considered to be the best and most reliable account that we have in terms of Alexander's conquests. If you like this kind of content, give it a like and subscribe. It does wonders in the algorithm. And enjoy as we begin reading from the Anabasis of Alexander. Do bear in mind that this is not the beginning of the work. This leads on from the 6th chapter that deals with the events leading up to and at the Battle of Issus, following the aftermath as well at the end. So with that in mind, let's begin chapter 6. Alexander advances to Myrandrus. Darius marches against him. While he was still at Malus, he was informed that Darius was encamped with all his forces at Sochi, a place in the land of Assyria, distant about 2 days' march from the Assyrian gates. Then indeed he collected the companions and told them what was reported about Darius and his army. They urged him to lead on as they were, without delay. At the time he commended them and broke up the conference. But next day he led them forward against Darius and the Persians. On the second day he passed through the gates and encamped near the city of Myrandrus, but in the night a heavy tempest and a violent storm of wind and rain occurred which detained him in his camp. Darius, on the other hand, had been spending a long time with his army, having chosen a plain in the land of Assyria, which stretches out in every direction, suitable for the immense size of his army and convenient for the evolutions of cavalry. Amyntas, son of Antiochus, the deserter from Alexander, advised him not to abandon this position, because there was plenty of room for the great multitude of the Persians and for the vast quantity of their baggage. And so Darius remained, but as Alexander made a long stay at Tarsus on account of his illness, and not a short one at Soli, where he offered sacrifice and conducted his army in procession, and moreover spent some time marching against the Cilician mountaineers, Darius was induced to swerve from his resolution. He was also not willing to be led to form whatever decision was most agreeable to his own wishes, and being influenced by those who gave him the advice which they had thought to be pleasant to him, without consideration of its utility, for kings will always have associates to give them bad advice, he came to the conclusion that Alexander was no longer desirous of advancing further, but was shrinking from an encounter upon learning that Darius himself was marching against him. On all sides they were urging him on, asserting that he would trample down the army of the Macedonians with his cavalry. Nevertheless, Amyntas, at any rate, confidently affirmed that Alexander would certainly come to any place where he had heard Darius might be, and he exhorted him by all means to stay where he was. but the worse advice, because at the immediate time it was more pleasant to hear prevailed. Moreover, he was led by some divine influence into the locality where he derived that little advantage from his cavalry and from the sheer number of men, javelins, and bows, and where he could not even exhibit the mere magnificence of his army, but surrendered to Alexander and his troops to an easy victory, for it was already decreed by fate that the Persians should be deprived of the rule of Asia by the Macedonians, just as the Medes had been deprived of it by the Persians, and still earlier, the Assyrians by the Medes. Chapter 7. Darius at Issus, Alexander's speech to his army. Darius crossed the mountain range by what are called the Ammanic Gates, and advancing towards Issus, came without being noticed to the rear of Alexander. Having reached Issus, he captured as many Macedonians as had been left behind on account of illness. These he cruelly mutilated and slew. Next day, he proceeded to the river Pinarus, as soon as Alexander heard that Darius was in his rear, because the news did not seem to him trustworthy. He embarked some of the companions in a ship with 30 oars and sent them back to Issus to observe whether the report was true. The men who sailed in the 30-oared ship discovered Persians encamped there more easily, because the sea in this part takes the form of a bay. They, therefore, brought back word to Alexander that Darius was at hand. Alexander then called together all the generals, commanders of the cavalry, and leaders of the Grecian allies, and exhorted them to take courage from the dangers which they had already surmounted, asserting that the struggle would be between themselves, who had previously victorious, and a foe who had already been beaten, and that the deity was acting as part of general on behalf better than himself, by putting it into the mind of Darius to move his forces from the spacious plain and shut them up in a narrow place, where was sufficient room for them to deepen their phalanx by marching from front to rear, but where the vast multitude would be useless for the enemy in battle. He added that their foes were similar to them, neither in strength nor in courage, for the Macedonians, who had been long practiced in warlike toils, accompanied with danger, were coming into close conflict with Persians and Medes, who had then become unnerved by a long course of luxurious ease. To crown all, they being free men, were about to engage in battle with men who were slaves. He said, moreover, that the Greeks who were in the two armies would not be fighting for the same objects, for those with Darius were braving danger for pay, and that pay not high, whereas those on their side were voluntarily defending the interests of Greece. Again, of foreigners, the Thracians, Paeonians, Illyrians, Agrianians, who were the most robust and warlike of men in Europe, were about to be arrayed against the most sluggish and effeminate races of Asia. In addition to all this, Alexander was commanding in the field against Darius. These things he enumerated as evidences of the superiority in the struggle. And then he began to point out the great rewards they would win from the danger to be incurred, for he told them that on the occasion they would overcome not merely the viceroys of Darius, nor the cavalry drawn up of the Granicus, nor the 20,000 Grecian mercenaries, but would overcome all the available forces of the Persians and the Medes, as well as all the other races subject to them dwelling in Asia, and the great king present in person. After this conflict, nothing would be left for them to do except to take possession of all of Asia and to put an end to their many labors. In addition to this, he reminded them of their brilliant achievements in their collective capacity in days gone by. And if any man had individually performed any distinguished feat of valor from love of glory, he mentioned him by name in commemoration of the deed. He then recapitulated as modestly as possible his own daring deeds in various battles. He is also said to have reminded them of Xenophon and the 10,000 men who accompanied him, asserting that the latter were in no way comparable with them in even number or general excellence. Besides, they had with them neither Thessalian, Boeotian, Peloponnesian, Macedonian, or Thracian horsemen, nor any other of the cavalry which was in the Macedonian army, nor had any of the archers or slingers, except a few Cretans and Rhodians, and even these were got ready by Xenophon on the spur of the moment in the very crisis of danger. And yet, even these put the king and all of his forces to rout close to Babylon itself, and succeeded in reaching the Euxine Sea, after defeating all the races which lay in their way as they were marching down thither. He also adduced whether other arrangements were suitable for a great commander to use in order to encourage brave men in such a critical moment before the perils of battle. They urged him to lead them against the foe without delay, coming from all sides to grasp the king's right hand, and encouraging him by their promises. Chapter 8. Arrangement of the hostile armies. Alexander then ordered his soldiers to take their dinner, and having sent a few of his horsemen and archers forward to the gates to reconnoitre the road in the rear, he took the whole of his army and marched in the night to occupy the pass again. When about midnight he had again got possession of it, he caused the army to rest the remainder of the night there upon the rocks, having posted vigilant sentries. At the approach of dawn, he began to descend from the pass along the road, and as long as the space was narrow everywhere, he led his army in column. But when the mountains parted, so as to leave a plain behind them, he kept on opening out the column into the phalanx, marching one line of heavy armed infantry, and another up into the line towards the mountain on the right and towards the sea on the left. Up to this time, his cavalry had been ranged behind the infantry, but when they advanced into the open country, he began to draw up his army in order of battle. First, upon the right wing, near the mountain, he placed his infantry guard and the shield-bearers under the command of Nicanor, son of Parmenio. Next to these the regiment of Coenus, and close to them that of Perdiccas. These troops were posted as far as the middle of the heavy armed infantry to one beginning from the right. On the left wing first stood the regiment of Amyntas, then that of Ptolemy, and close to this, that of Meleager. The infantry on the left had been placed under the command of Craterus, but Parmenio held the chief direction of the whole left wing. This general had been ordered not to abandon to the sea, so that they might not be surrounded by the foreigners, who were likely to outflank them on all sides by their superior numbers. But as soon as Darius was certified of Alexander's approach for the battle, he conveyed about 30,000 of his cavalry, and with them 20,000 of his light-armed infantry to cross the river Pinarus, in order that he might be able to draw up the rest of his forces with ease. Of the heavy armed infantry, he placed first the 30,000 Greek mercenaries to oppose the phalanx of the Macedonians, and on both sides of these he placed 60,000 of the men called Cardaces, who were also heavily armed infantry. For the place where they were posted was able to contain only this number in a single phalanx. He also posted 20,000 men near the mountain on their left and facing Alexander's right. Some of these troops were also in the rear of Alexander's army, for the mountain near where they were posted in one part sloped in a great back way and formed a sort of bay, like a bay in the sea, and afterwards bending forwards caused the men who had been posted at the foot of it to be behind Alexander's right wing. The remaining multitude of Darius's light-armed and heavily armed infantry was marshalled by nations to an unserviceable depth, and placed behind the Grecian mercenaries and the Persian army arranged in a phalanx. The whole of the army with Darius was said to number about 600,000 fighting men. As Alexander advanced, he found that the ground spread out a little in breadth, and he accordingly brought up his horsemen, both those called companions, and the Thessalians, as well as the Macedonians, and posted them with himself on the right wing. The Peloponnesians and the rest of the allied Greeks he had sent to Parmenio on the left. When Darius had marshalled his phalanx, by a preconcerted signal he recalled the cavalry which he had posted on the front of the river for the express purpose of rendering the arranging of his army easily. Most of these he placed on the right wing near the sea, facing Parmenio, because here the ground was more suited for the evolutions of cavalry. A certain part of them also he led up to the mountain towards the left, but when they were seen to be useless there on the account of the narrowness of the ground, he ordered most of these also to ride round to the right wing and join their comrades there. Darius himself occupied the center of the whole army, inasmuch as it was the custom for the kings of Persia to take up that position, the reason of which arrangement has been recorded by Xenophon, son of Grylus. Chapter 9. Alexander changes the disposition of his forces. Meanwhile, when Alexander perceived that nearly all the Persian cavalry had changed their ground and gone to his left towards the sea, and that on his side only the Peloponnesians and the rest of the Grecian cavalry were posted there, he sent the Thessalian cavalry thither with speed, ordering them not to ride along before the front of the whole army, lest they should be seen by the enemy to be shifting their ground, but to proceed by stealth in the rear of the phalanx. In front of the cavalry on the right, he posted the lancers under command of Protomarchus, and the Paeonians under that of Aristo, and of the infantry, the archers under the direction of Antiochus, and the Agrianians under that of Attalus. Some of the cavalry and archers he also drew up as to form an angle with the center towards the mountain which was in the rear. So on the right of his phalanx had been drawn up separated into two wings, the one fronting Darius, and the main body of the Persians beyond the river, and the other facing those who had been posted at the mountain in the rear. On the left wing, the infantry consisting of the Cretan archers and the Thracians under command of Sitalces were posted in the front, and before these, the cavalry towards the left. The Grecian mercenaries were drawn up as a reserve for all them. When he perceived that the phalanx towards the right was too thin, and it seemed likely that the Persians would outflank him here considerably, he ordered 2 squadrons of the Campanian cavalry, viz. the Anthemusium and of which the Peroides, son of Menetheusius, was captain, and that which was called Leogaean, under the command of Pantodanus, son of Cleander, to proceed from the centre of the right without being seen. Having also marched the archers, part of the Agrianians, and the Grecian mercenaries up along his right into the front, he extended his phalanx beyond the wing of the Persians. But when those who had been posted upon the mountain did not descend, a charge was made by a few of the Agrianians and archers at Alexander's order, by which they were easily put to rout from the foot of the mountain. As they fled to the summit, he decided that he could make use of the men who had been drawn up to keep these in check, to fill up the ranks of his phalanx. He thought it quite sufficient to post 300 horsemen to watch the men on the mountain. Chapter 10. The Battle of Issus. Having thus marshalled his men, he caused them to rest for some time, and then led them forward, as he thought the enemy's approach was very slow. For Darius was no longer leading the foreigners against him, as he had arranged them at first, but he remained in position upon the bank of the river, which was in many parts steep, and in certain places, where it seemed more easy to ascend, he extended a stockade upon it. By this it was at once evident to Alexander's men that Darius had become cowed in spirit. But when the armies at length met in conflict, Alexander rode about in every direction to exhort his troops, to show their valor, mentioning with befitting epithets and names, not only of the generals, but also of the captains of the cavalries and infantry, and of the Grecian mercenaries, as many were now more distinguished either by rank or of merit. From all sides arose a shout, not to delay, but to attack the enemy. At first he still led them on in close array with measured step, although he had the forces of Darius already in full view, lest by a more hasty march any part of the phalanx should fluctuate from the line and get separated from the rest. But when they came within range of darts, Alexander himself and those around him, being posed on the right wing, advanced first into the river with a run, in order to alarm the Persians by the rapidity of their onset, and by coming sooner to close conflict to receive little damage from the archers. And it turned out, just as Alexander had conjectured, for as soon as the battle became a hand-to-hand one, the part of the Persian army stationed on the left wing was put to rout, and here Alexander and his men won their brilliant victory. But the Grecian mercenaries serving under Darius attacked the Macedonians at the point where they saw their phalanx especially disordered. For the Macedonian phalanx had been broken and disjointed the right wing, because Alexander had charged into the river with such eagerness, and engaging in a hand-to-hand conflict was already driving back the Persians posted there. But the Macedonians in the centre did not execute their task with equal speed, and finding many parts of the bank steep and precipitous, they were unable to preserve the front of the phalanx in the same line. Here, then, the struggle was desperate. The aim of the Grecian mercenaries of Darius began to push the Macedonians back into the river and regain the victory. Though their own forces were already flying, the aim of the Macedonians being not to fall short of Alexander's good fortune, which was already manifest, and not to tarnish the glory of the phalanx, which, up to that time, had been commonly asserted to be invincible. Moreover, The feeling of rivalry which existed between the Grecian and Macedonian races inspired each side in the conflict. Here fell Ptolemy, son of Seleucus, after proving himself a valiant man, besides about 120 of other Macedonians of no mean repute. Chapter 11. The defeat and flight of Darius. Hereupon the regiments on the right wing, perceiving that the Persians opposed to them had already been put to rout, wheeled round towards the Grecian mercenaries of Darius and their own hard-pressed detachment. Having driven the Greeks away from the river, they extended their phalanx beyond the Persian army, on the side which had been broken, and attacking the Greeks on the flank, were already beginning to cut them up. However, the Persian cavalry, which had been posted opposite the Thessalians, did not remain on the other side of the river during the struggle, but came through the water and made a vigorous attack upon the Thessalian squadrons. In this place a fierce cavalry battle ensued, for the Persians did not give way until they perceived that Darius had fled, and the Grecian mercenaries had been cut up by the phalanx and severed from them. And then at last the flight of all the Persians was plainly visible. Their horses suffered much injury in the retreat, because the riders were heavily armed, and the horsemen themselves, being so many in number and retreating in panicked terror, without any regard to order along narrow roads, were trampled on and injured, no less by each other than by the pursuing enemy. The Thessalians also followed them up with vigor, so that no fewer of the cavalry than of the infantry were slaughtered in the flight. But as soon as the left wing of Darius was terrified and routed by Alexander, and the Persian king perceived that this part of his army was severed from the rest, without any further delay, he began to flee in his chariot along with the rest, just as he was. He was conveyed safely in the chariot, as long as he met with level ground in his flight, but when he lighted upon ravines and other rough ground, he left the chariot there, divesting himself of his shield and Median mantle. He even left his bow in the chariot, and mounting a horse continued his flight. That night, which came on soon after, alone rescued him from being captured by Alexander, for as long as there was daylight, the latter kept up in pursuit at full speed. But when it began to grow dark, and the ground before the feet became invisible, he turned back again to the camp. After capturing the chariot of Darius with the shield, the Median mantle, and the bow within it. For his pursuit had been too slow for him to overtake Darius, because, though he wheeled round on the first breaking asunder of the phalanx, yet he did not turn to pursue him until he observed that the Grecian mercenaries and the Persian cavalry had been driven away from the river. Of the Persians killed were Arsames, Leomithres, and Atizes, who had commanded the cavalry at the Granicus. Sabaces, the viceroy of Egypt, and Bubaces of the Persian dignitaries were also killed, besides about 100,000 of the private soldiers, among them being more than 10,000 cavalry. So great was the slaughter that Ptolemy, son of Lagus, who then accompanied Alexander, says that the men who were with them pursuing Darius, coming into the pursuit of the ravine, filled it up with the corpses, and so passed over it. the camp of Darius was taken forthwith at the first assault, containing his mother, his wife, who was also his sister, and his infant son. His 2 daughters and a few other women, wives of Persian peers who were in attendance upon them, were likewise captured. For the other Persians happened to have dispatched their women along with the rest of their property to Damascus, because Darius had sent to that city the greater part of his money and all the other things which the great king was in habit of taking with him as necessary for his luxurious mode of living, even though he was going on a military expedition. The consequence was that in the camp no more than 3,000 talents were captured, and soon after the money in Damascus was also seized by Parmenio, who was dispatched thither for that very purpose. Such was the result of this famous battle, which was fought in the month of Maimakterion, when Nicostratus was Archon of the Athenians. Chapter 12. Kind treatment of Darius's family. The next day, Alexander, though suffering from a wound that he had received in the thigh from a sword, visited the wounded, and having collected the bodies of the slain, he gave them a splendid burial with all his forces most brilliantly marshalled in order of battle. He also spoke with eulogy to those whom he himself had recognized performing any gallant deed in battle, and also to those whose exploits he had learned by full report, fully corroborated. He likewise honored each of them individually, with a gift of money in proportion to his desert. He then appointed Belacrus, son of Nicantor, one of the royal bodyguards, viceroy of Cilicia, and in his place among the bodyguards he chose Menes, son of Dionysius. In the room of Ptolemy, son of Seleucus, who had been killed in the battle, he appointed Polysperchon, son of Simmias, to the command of a brigade. He remitted to the Solians the 50 talents which were still due to the money imposed on them as a fine, and he gave them back their hostages. Nor did he treat the mother, wife, or children of Darius with any neglect. For some of those who have written Alexander's history say that on the very night which he returned from the pursuit of Darius, entering the Persian king's tent, for which he had selected for his use, he heard the lamentation of women and other noises similar kind not far from the tent. Inquiring therefore who the women were, and why they were in tent so near, he was answered by someone as follows: O king, the mother, wife, and children of Darius are lamenting for him as slain, since they have been informed that thou hast his bow and royal mantle, and that his shield has been brought back. When Alexander heard this, he sent Leonatus and one of his companions to them, with injunctions to tell them, Darius is still alive. In his flight he left his arms and mantle in the chariot, and these are the only things of his that Alexander has. Leonatus entered the tent and told them the news of Darius, saying, moreover, that Alexander would allow them to retain the state and retinue befitting their royal rank, as well as the title of queens, for he had not undertaken war against Darius from a feeling of hatred, but had conducted it in a legitimate manner for the empire of Asia. Such are the statements of Ptolemy and Aristobulus. But there is another report, to the effect that on the day Alexander himself following went to the tent, accompanied alone by Hephaestion, one of his companions, the mother of Darius, being in doubt which one of them was the king, for they had both arrayed themselves in the same style of dress, went up to Hephaestion, because he appeared the taller of the two, and prostrated herself before him. But when he drew back, and one of her attendants pointed out Alexander, saying he was the king, she was ashamed of her mistake, and was going to retire. But the king told her that she had made no mistake, for Hephaestion was also an Alexander. This I record, neither being sure of its truth, nor thinking it altogether unreliable. If it really occurred, I commend Alexander for his compassionate treatment of the women, and the confidence he felt in his companion, and the honor bestowed on him. But if it merely seems probable to historians that Alexander would have acted and spoken thus, even for this reason, I think him worthy of commendation. Chapter 13. Flight of Macedonian deserters into Egypt. Proceedings of Agis, king of Sparta. Alexander occupies Phoenicia. Darius fled through the night with a few attendants, but in the daytime, picking up as he went along the Persians and Grecian mercenaries who had come out safely of the battle, he had in all 4,000 men under his command. He then made a forced march towards the city of Thapsacus and the river Euphrates, in order to put that river as soon as possible between himself and Alexander. But Amyntas, son of Antiochus, Thymondas, son of Mentor, Aristomedes the Pharian, and Bianor the Arcanian, all being deserters, fled without delay from the posts assigned to them in the battle, with about 8,000 soldiers under their command, and passing through the mountains they arrived at Tripolis in Phoenicia. It was there they seized the ships which had been hauled up on the shore, in which they had previously been transported from Lesbos. They launched as many of these vessels as they thought sufficient to convey them, and the rest they burned there in the docks. In order not to supply their enemy with the means of quickly pursuing them, they fled first to Cyprus, thence to Egypt, where Amyntas shortly after, meddling in political disputes, was killed by the natives. Meanwhile, Pharnabazus and Autophrodates were staying near Chios. Then, having established a garrison in the island, they dispatched some of their ships to Kos and Halicarnassus, and with 100 of their best sailing vessels, they put to sea themselves and landed at Cypnus. And Agis, king of the Lacedaemonians, came to them with 1 trireme, both to ask for money to carry on the war, and also to urge them to send with him into the Peloponnese as large a force both naval and military as they could. At that very time, news reached them of the battle which had been fought at Issus, and being alarmed, Pharnabazus started off to Chios with 12 triremes and 1,500 Greek mercenaries, for fear that the Chians might attempt to effect a revolution when they received the news of the Persian defeat. Agis, having received from Autophrodates 30 talents of silver and 10 triremes, dispatched Hippias to lead these ships to his brother Agesilaus at Tanerum, ordering him also to instruct Agesilaus to pay the full to the sailors, and then sail as quickly as possible to Crete, in order to set things in order there. Well, for a time he himself remained there among the islands, but afterwards joined Autophrodates at Halicarnassus. Alexander appointed Menon, son of Cerdemas, viceroy of Coele Syria, giving him the cavalry of the Grecian allies to guard the country. He then went in person towards Phoenicia, and on the march he was met by Strato, the son of Gerostratus, king of the Arrians and of the people living near Aradus. But Gerostratus himself was serving in the fleet with Autophrodates, as were all the other kings of both the Phoenicians and the Cyprians. When Strato fell in with Alexander, he placed a golden crown upon his head, promising to surrender him both the island of Aradus and the great and prosperous city of Marathus, situated on the mainland right opposite Aradus. Also Sigon, the city of Mariame, along with other places under his dominion and that of his father. Chapter 14. The Letter from Darius and Alexander's Reply. While Alexander was still in Marathus, ambassadors came bringing a letter from Darius, entreating him to give up to their king his mother, wife, and children. They were also instructed to support this petition by word of mouth. The letter pointed out to him that friendship and alliance had subsisted between Philip and Artaxerxes, and that when Arses, the son of Artaxerxes, ascended to the throne, Philip was the first to practice injustice towards him, though he had suffered no injury from the Persians. Alexander also, from the time when Darius began to reign over the Persians, had not sent any one to confirm the friendship and alliance which had so long existed, but had crossed over into Asia with his army and inflicted much injury upon the Persians. For this reason, he had come down in person to defend his country and preserve the empire of his fathers. As to the battle, it had been decided, as seemed good to some of the gods. And now he, a king, begged his captured wife, mother, and children from a king, and he wished to form a friendship with him and become his ally. For this purpose he requested Alexander to send men to him with Meniscus and Arsimas, the messengers who came from the Persians, to receive pledges of fidelity from him, and to give them on behalf of Alexander. To this, Alexander wrote a reply, and sent Thersippus with men who had come from Darius, with instructions to give the letter to Darius, but not to converse anything. Alexander's letter ran thus: Your ancestors came into Macedonia and the rest of Greece, and treated us ill, without any previous injury from us. I, having been appointed commander-in-chief of the Greeks, and wishing to take revenge on the Persians, crossed into Asia, hostilities being begun by you. For you sent aid to the Perinthians, who were dealing unjustly with my father, and Ochus sent forces into Thrace, which was under our rule. My father was killed by conspirators whom you instigated, as you of yourself have boasted to all in your letters, and after slaying Arses as well as Bagoas, and unjustly seizing the throne contrary to the law of the Persians, and ruling your subjects unjustly, you sent unfriendly letters about me to the Greeks, urging them to wage war with me. You have also dispatched money to the Lacedaemonians and other certain Greeks, but none of the states received it, except the Lacedaemonians. As your agents destroyed my friends, who were striving to dissolve the league which I had formed among the Greeks, I took the field against you, because you were party who commenced this hostility. Since I have vanquished your generals and viceroys in previous battle, and now yourself and your forces in like manner, I am, by the gift of the gods, in possession of your land, as many of the men who fought in your army were not killed in battle, but fled to me for refuge. I am protecting, and they are with me, not against their own will, but they are serving in my army as volunteers. Come to me, therefore, since I am the lord of all Asia, but if you are afraid you may suffer any harsh treatment from me in case you do come to me, send some of your friends to receive pledges of safety from me. Come to me then, and ask for your mother, wife, children, and anything else you wish, for whatever you ask, you will receive, and nothing shall be denied you. But for the future, whenever you send to me as the king of Asia, and do not address me to whom your wishes as to an equal. But if you are in need of anything, speak to me as the man who is the lord of all your territories. If you act otherwise, I shall deliberate concerning you as an evildoer. And if you dispute my right to the kingdom, stay and fight another battle for it, but do not run away. For wherever you may be, I intend to march against you. This is the letter which he sent to Darius. And march against him he certainly did. With that, we've reached the end of the account from Arrian of Nicomedia. And as is customary, I've got to thank my top-tier supporters, my very own companions. Dark, Carey, Kimberly, Ember, Ben, Britt, Charles, Erin, James, Jeffrey, Melissa, Scott, Stark Factory, Wendy, Jaden, Sherry, Jessica, Christine, Sally, Katiana, Christine, Fizabo, Legitmus, Maverick, Susan. Thank you very much. I appreciate every one of you. It certainly helps to keep the channel going. And I hope you enjoyed it. I will see you next time, tomorrow, if you feel inclined to visit me again, or whenever we cross paths. I'm sure it'll only be a matter of time. Good night. Lots of love to you all.